welcome to my channel, Haylee Marie Vintage. Today I am really excited for the sewing project I have, and I'm excited to get back to sewing. I have not sewn for about 3 weeks, which is quite long for me, and I've been missing it. I had my sewing machine in the shop and was traveling, and so all of that had me not sewing. So I'm excited to kick off and have this project. So recently I did a poll with a couple different patterns and fabrics and sewing projects and had you guys vote. There was one very clear winner, and it was this fabric here. This is a nice like green linen that I got years ago. I've had this a long time. This was a really early fabric purchase and a really cheap vintage fabric purchase. It's really high quality, really beautiful, and I'm excited to make a dress with it. This is the pattern I am using. It is from 1951. I'm gonna need to make a couple sizing adjustments around the waist. Otherwise, it should all work pretty darn well. Looking at this should be really straightforward. I probably will have to technically add a little bit into the skirt, but that should be easy enough. This does have a side zipper. I prefer back zipper, so I will make the alteration of moving this to the back. But other than that, I'm gonna make no different modifications with this. So this should be a pretty straightforward project. I'm actually excited for an easier sewing project. It's been a little bit since I've done an easy breezy semi-mindless sewing project. So yeah, I'm rather excited for that. The poll that I put out was essentially a poll, and I'm finally starting to work through some of the vintage fabric I've had that I've been too afraid to work with for the past few years. I feel confident in my ability to sew. I feel like my weight fluctuations have kind of evened out, so I can feel confident that these clothes will fit me for a bit. So I finally feel ready to dig into my stash. So that is what we're doing in this project, and then the project in 2 weeks is going to be another project from the polls. This should be straightforward and fun and hopefully a kind of easy win, and I already have the background. I'm going to take the photos and chosen out. I have to get going and get this all sewn up before those flowers fade away. So let's go ahead and jump into sewing this project. Alright, first we are starting with the cutting of this fabric. As you can see, Spooky is engaged. So this was really straightforward. I basically just followed the pattern. I did add a 1/2 inch to both the front and the back sides, so that way it would give me a total of 2 inches for a more comfortable fit. I do feel like after taking those pattern classes, I feel much more empowered to alter my patterns the way I want. I know in some ways I'm not technically doing it the right way, but this works for me, so it's the way I'm going to continue to do it. Otherwise, the only thing to note that I didn't realize before I started cutting out my fabric is this fabric actually has quite a bit of discoloration. It's really subtle and you really hardly notice, but it is there, and there's too much of it to avoid it, so I just went ahead and cut my pattern out like normal. I will try to get like a close-up of the discoloration on the fabric, but I have a really hard time seeing it outside of certain lights, and I'm not sure that the camera will pick it up. After finishing that, I am now cutting out the inner facing. For this one, I'm using, it's called sheer in a medium as opposed to a light. This will give it a little bit more structure, but not too much rigidity. My next step here is just to use a pressing cloth to iron on the inner facing. It's important to use a pressing cloth to protect your iron from the glue that is on these. Working with inner facing is never my favorite, but it does make a huge difference in the final garment. One of the things I'm doing here for early prep work is I am folding over the top of this bodice piece. This is like the waist piece, and basically the way this dress is assembled is you actually top stitch this down, which means you have to have a nice line pressed. So that is what I'm doing here. It's really early to be doing this, but I just kind of felt like getting it done. And then at this point, I am also pinning the shoulder seams together. This is just a little bit different of a method because I am moving the zipper to the back instead of having it on the side, and this does change the way I follow the instructions quite a bit in this pattern. I am also pinning together the collars at this stage. One of the most exciting things about this pattern is no darts, so here I am just putting gathering stitches in, and I would rather gather something than do a dart any day. So I was pretty excited. As usual, I am running 3 rows of gathering stitches. And then here I am sewing those collars together, pretty easy. The curves weren't too bad on this one. And then I am also going to be sewing together the shoulders of the garment. My last step at this machine is me going ahead and finishing the seam for the facing by just folding it over by about 1/4 inch. This fabric is tightly woven enough that I am just finishing it using pinking shears. before going ahead and pressing all of my seams. And then since the collar is curved, I am just clipping all of those and getting those seams to be a little bit thinner so they aren't as visible from the outside when I actually press them. And then I am turning those inside out and using my little tool here to get the edges ready to actually be pressed. And then here I'm going ahead and I am pinning the collar and matching up all the notches and marks and stuff. For that, this was pretty straightforward and easy. And then after basting the collar, I'm going to go ahead and pin on the facings for this. And then of course I am just sewing that facing. So when I baste the collar on, I now baste at 4/8 of an inch or 1/2 inch because the seam allowance is 5 inches, not 5 inches, that would be a lot. 5/8 of an inch. I won't actually have to pull out any of those basting stitches I used earlier, but they're still close enough that everything stays in place like it should. And then I am clipping my corners and clipping my curves and stuff on that so that way it will then be ready to understitch, which is what I end up doing here. Understitching is really important. I used to skip it earlier in my sewing journey, but it really does make those edges lie just more flat and correctly, so it's something I never skip now. I do like to note that vintage pattern instructions don't tell you to understitch. I think they assume you know to understitch. So even if a pattern doesn't tell you to understitch, I still recommend it. And then here I am ironing everywhere that I stitched for the facing down, making sure everything is laying correctly. And then my next step is adding buttonholes. I went back and forth a lot on the color of these buttonholes. So there wasn't a good matching green thread for this fabric. The fabric was a little bit too brown for most of the green threads in store. So as you can see here, the greens may be a little brighter than I would like. But I decided black would be like too much, and so would white or like cream to match the flowers. So I just felt like it was my best option. I didn't show you this on camera, but off camera I did do several practice buttonholes because the buttons I'm using are some bigger like ball buttons, and getting the buttonhole size right is kind of challenging. You don't want to make it too big, but you also need it to be big enough to get the whole button through. So I did a ton of testing off camera. I think it took me 5 test buttonholes to get a buttonhole I was happy with. I was technically supposed to baste the shirt front up the middle so that way it would settle correctly when I put on the waistband, but I went ahead and skipped that step because I trust my abilities to do this well enough. I kept going back and forth on how exactly I want to do this. So like I said, this is designed with a side zipper and I prefer a back zipper. I had to alter like the steps of this because in the pattern instructions it tells you to sew the waistbands together first and then sew them to the bodice. And for a back zipper, I felt like that didn't make sense because I was working with 3 pieces instead of 2. So I went ahead and I gathered the stitches down, which is what you're seeing me do here. And I'm matching things up for the front, and then I am also doing the same for the back, and then also the side seams together that way. I think this worked well enough. I could have probably still gone with what the instructions told me to do, but this is what made more sense in my head for more efficiency. In here, I'm doing the back as well. The back does have gathers instead of darts too, which is of course to me a nice feature because I do not enjoy doing darts. I do want to note here that what you're seeing me do is I am first pinning from the back, and then since I have to top stitch and stitch from the top, I'm then putting more pins in the front and then pulling the pins in the back, but I have the pins done in the back to make sure I am lining up with the seam allowance that was allotted for me. I feel I can't do it from the front. I mean, maybe some people can just do it from the front, but I can't get things to match properly if I do it from the front. And now it is top stitching time. One thing that did make me feel better about the buttonholes feeling kind of bright is the fact that there was so much top stitching on this dress, so that bright green stitching did end up in other places, which I thought was great. And then here I am pulling out all those basting stitches that I used to gather. I like to do this as I go because I find it quite satisfying and it re-energizes me for the next portion of the project. And here I'm going to go ahead and attach the front to the back via the side seams off camera, as well as baste the back seam down so I can get it all pressed and ready to insert the zipper. And that is all I am doing for today. Tomorrow I will work on the skirt and finishing up the dress. All right, good afternoon. We are starting sewing here at about 1:15. I had some errands to run this morning and it's also beautiful out, like an unexpected beautiful beautiful day, so I had to go out and enjoy it a little bit before starting sewing. But let's talk about where we ended off last night. So last night I stopped sewing a little bit earlier than planned because basically I sewed this part wrong, which is where it connects. This doesn't connect flat no matter what way I turn it. Basically, I just connected it incorrectly, and kind of my rule is if I'm sewing and I do something like this, my rule is I stop for the day because I don't often make really silly mistakes like this. So if I am making mistakes like this, I'm probably like not in the right mind space for sewing. Yesterday, I was feeling pretty like anxious, depressed. I don't exactly know what to call all the feelings I had yesterday, but yesterday was just like not a great mental health day for me. And then when I got back to sewing, I made a silly mistake. So I took the rest of the night off sewing. I watched some movies. I watched the 2017 remake of The Beguiling, maybe. It's with Nicole Kidman. I went on kind of a Nicole Kidman deep dive because I watched Moulin Rouge before that because I hadn't watched it before and felt like it. So I instead knocked out 2 movies last night. And then today I'm going to focus on finishing up this dress. I think it should still be totally doable to do this day. First things first, I've got to fix my mistake. And then after that, I'm going to at least do the machine stitching for the armhole. And then after that, I should be done with the bodice and ready to move on to the skirt. That is the plan. Oh my goodness, and Spooky is very hyper right now, so we'll see how that goes. All right, let's go ahead and hop to it. All right, here I am going ahead and picking that side seam. After I picked the side seam, it was still showing wonky, and I figured out it was the back seam actually that was making it wonky, which was a real bummer to find out because that one would have been a lot easier to pick because it was basting stitches. But off camera, I re-sewed the side seam, and the back seam I left the way it is because the back seam, the whole real main goal was to have it all ready for the zipper, which it was. So the angle here is really weird, but what I am doing here is I have cut 2-inch wide bias tape of the same fabric. I had a lot of this fabric left over, and a lot of times I'll resell the fabric I have left over, but this is discolored enough that I'm not planning on doing that, so I went ahead and cut my bias strips with it. And then I'm using those bias strips to make the facings for the armhole, as well as I will use them on the back of the neck. So here I am going ahead and I am sewing those facings down, and then of course after I have them sewn down, I am understitching them so they will lay nicely. And then I am pressing them. One of the ways I am pressing them is I am folding over the rest of the bias binding, so that way it will be a nice clean finished edge when I hand stitch this down at the end. That finished up the bodice, so now we are moving on to the skirt. First I am sewing up the back and the front seams. So with the back seam, I am leaving I think 5 inches because that is for the length of zipper I chose. When you do move your zipper, you have to kind of make a discretionary zipper call. This one I could have used anywhere between a 22-inch zipper to a 26-inch zipper. The best color was in the 22, even though a 24 would have probably been my preferred length. I decided to prioritize the color matching, but I do like to note because that is why you see me getting out this ruler here to check how far I have to stitch down for that 22-inch zipper to fit in nicely. And then of course I am stitching these down. This is really simple and straightforward. Putting together the skirts is always one of the easiest processes. And here the other thing I do is I will switch to a basting stitch for the last 5 inches of the one that has the zipper. I didn't show that on camera, but that is something I do. And I'm again finishing my seams with pinking shears before pressing them open. And then I'm going ahead and I am pinning the side seams together. And then here I am putting in these basting stitches. This pattern actually has you leave the front flap and then have most of the gathering on the hips. This is not as gathered or fold as a peasant dress I did a little bit while back when I did the skirt this way, but it's always fun to have a pattern where that's already built in and I'm not making the decisions to have it built in that way. This is definitely, like I said, less gathered than that skirt, but I don't mind it, and that is what happens when you work with an earlier 1950s pattern. And then just like the top, we are going to be top stitching the skirt as well to this kind of bias cut band. And so what I'm doing here is I'm folding over the edge and pressing it to get it ready to top stitch. And then I am of course gathering everything down to make sure it hits all its markings and pinning it from the back. And then what you'll see me do here that is not super clear is, again, I am moving it to the front, putting the pins in the front so that way they are easier to top stitch without getting pin heads stuck every which way. But of course when I flip it, it becomes less clear because it's already pinned, so I don't need it like put together as flat. While I gather this is your reminder that I put a ton of time and love into this channel, and you can support me by buying me a coffee over on Ko-fi. I have the link down in the description, and I always really appreciate it. Let's jump back into sewing. And then here I am top stitching this. This worked really well and I didn't mind it at all. Next up, what I am doing is I am putting in the interfacing tape I like to use with zippers that are on flimsier fabrics like this one. This just helps me sew in the zipper better. This is not a washout tape. They do sell washout tapes where eventually when you wash it, it will come out. I don't prefer that personally just because I don't mind having that stiffness around the zipper. I feel like it kind of gives that zipper some reinforcement and help. And I also don't really like lint and fuzz and different stuff that like soak away interfacing sometimes leaves. But the trick with this interfacing is you still do need to iron it down first with a paper on. This just helps it stay, and then you peel the paper up and you do the other side because it is a double-sided interface tape. So that is what I'm doing here, and then after that I'm going to prep to sew in the zipper. Everybody has a zipper sewing method that works for them. Mine is maybe strange because I don't like to use pins. You did see me take out one pin here, and I just use one pin at the top to sew in exactly at the position I want, and then I'd like to do a lapped zipper. I can't do an even like half and half zipper well. I've tried a bunch of different methods. It just doesn't work for me. I prefer a placket look where only one side is covering the zipper. So that is what I'm doing here. First, I am sewing close to the zipper on the way down. Again, no pins. I'm just letting the fabric do its thing, and then when I get out into the bottom, I sew a little bit past the zipper stop, turn the two corners, and then come back up the other side, making sure I am pulling the fabric enough over to cover the zipper. Again, everybody does zippers different. This is what works best for me, and I have found that once I stopped using pins, it made my zippers so much less bubbly, and they were more likely to actually like line up everything. So that is what I'm doing here. And then everybody likes to hem a little bit differently on curved hems like this. What I like to do is I go ahead and I first finish my seam by just folding the fabric over and sewing I was going to say a 1/4 inch, but this looks more like a 1/2 inch seam, which you can see here. And then after I finish this up, I go ahead and I put basting stitches, stopping at putting a gap in the basting at every single panel. So that way it's easier to pull and adjust. And I'll show you what I'm going to do with that. This is, again, what works best with me for rounded skirt hems. I know different people like different things. I've tried pretty much all the methods, and this is the one that works best for me, even though I guess it's probably technically a little bit more work and uses a little bit more thread. And then here I am using my gauge to get the 2.5 inches I want to hem this at. And then I am going ahead and I am pulling this thread. So the reason I put in that like gathering stitch is so that way I can pull it and I can ease the fabric in between, because when you do fold up a curved hem, the bottom of the hem is actually like shorter than the part that you've hemmed up, and I'm pressing that, and that's how I get like the nicest and most professional seam, because I don't like to do a double fold hem because I don't like a visible hem. I like to do an invisible hem, which is what I'll do in a second in my hand stitching. But again, this is just what worked best for me. But it is a trick I picked up out of, I think, a 1950s sewing book. So if you haven't come across this trick, here it is. I've done this on my channel quite a bit, but it's been a little bit since I have done it, and I wanted to make sure all of my new subscribers saw it. And after this, I am just hand stitching all of my different facings and such. I prefer hand stitching because it does give that invisible look, and I am doing it around the neckline. I do all of it, and then around the arm seam, I find it actually works best if I tack it down at the armpit and then only do about half, basically the shoulder cap down, and then that leaves enough flexibility in the tape for it to not like pull or do anything weird, but keeps everything on the inside of the dress. Here is where I also get to sew in the buttons, which I absolutely adore these buttons. These are vintage buttons that I picked up somewhere on Etsy, and I think they look really cute with this dress. And then of course I move on to the hem, doing that invisible stitch. This hem was not as full as some of my hems, so it took very little time. And the last thing I have to do is slice my buttonholes open, which is I use fray check. Before I then use a buttonhole chisel to get the first bit open, and then I used scissors on these because they were like 3 buttonhole chisels wide, and I only really like to use the buttonhole chisel if it's only 2 wide. So I will move to scissors after I get them first open with the buttonhole chisel, which is what you will see here. And with that, we are ready for the reveal. All right, you've seen the reveal. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, we're going to go into the cost breakdown and then the outro / final thoughts. Did I sit? I did, didn't I? Jesus. Okay, so for the cost breakdown of this, this was cheap. I'm gonna start from the get-go by saying that this is probably the cheapest thing I've made in quite a while. So I only paid $16.52 for the fabric. I think this is just mainly because the fabric did have some weird like spots of discoloration on it, which again, you can't really notice, and I had a hard time filming for you guys, but it is there. And so that's why I think this big yardage of fabric that's really high quality was so discounted. However, I'm totally fine with it. The notions were $6.35. That includes the thread, the zipper, and then the buttons. The pattern was $6.60. This was a pattern that I picked up at an antique mall, so I didn't have a guarantee that it was like counted and everything was correct, but it did work. So that brings me to a supply total of $29.47. It's actually pretty crazy that this dress was cheap. Like, this is so cheap for how many yardage of fabrics it is, and with it being linen, and I'm just very pleased. As far as labor, this dress was a faster dress for me. This only took me 9 hours to make, which is pretty good. And I am multiplying that number by 32.70, which is a living wage here in Seattle. I classify a living wage as not living paycheck to paycheck and having a little extra money to save and not constantly stressing about financials, which is about 32.70 in Seattle. And being a seamstress is skilled labor, and I think skilled labor deserves a living wage. I mean, I also believe there's no such thing as unskilled labor. You need training to do pretty much any job. Multiplying that 9 by 32.70 gets you to $294.30 of labor, and so that brings us to a grand total of $323.77. I think this is super reasonable. This is the cheapest everything has broken out to be in a very long time, and I'm quite pleased with this dress. I mean, if you think about it, that's maybe not obviously reasonable to spend on a dress with a bunch of faded, weird fabric issues, but we're gonna real quick, I guess, talk about that. We're gonna start with the negatives and end with the positives as always. The only negative is probably the fading, which is gonna be fine because I've decided that since this dress is already faded, I'm gonna wear it when I do things like garden or make jam or stuff that might get it messy or dirty, and it'll be a great dress for that because I won't mind just throwing it in the wash. The fabric's already a little bit stained, so I figure I can use it a ton. The only other negative, I mentioned this in my voiceover, but the thread of the buttonholes, like, to me really stands out on this dress. But I think those are the only 2 negatives. Wow, the lighting just really changed. How fun. Oh, there we are. You did it, baby. Spooky is here to finish it off with some positives. So the positive is because of the discoloration, this is going to be a really useful dress for me. Also, I wore it to work the other day. It's really comfortable adding that extra. What are you doing? Hey, over here. Yeah, that's trouble. Come here. Hi, Goosey. Yeah, come here. Because this is so comfy and a little bit faded, I'm going, hey, careful. Okay. Sorry, Spooky, as always, takes over everything. She's probably also hitting my microphone Baby girl. Oh, no, I was gonna hold you. Is that acceptable? Okay, Spooky's gonna stay right here, it seems. You're probably gonna hear her purring. Hopefully your purring isn't louder than my voice. The fit of this is really nice. This is a 27-inch waist. I usually make things around 25, 25 and a half. And I think the 27-inch waist is a little bit bigger than I want because I like negative ease. I like a dress to kind of, not like suck me in, but I find really tight clothing kind of comfortable. Like it's a weird comfort thing for me. So I think in the future I would probably take off about a ½ inch from the waist and I think it would be perfect. However, the extra ½ inch that's in there makes it super comfy. I was able to like lounge and watch TV on the couch in this all day. I didn't like think about it or fuss with it at all. What are you doing? Sorry, I'm trying to get Spooky to be a normal cat. There we go. Did that work? Are you gonna stay? I need you to not hit the microphone over and over again though. Okay. So yeah, I think it's all a positive, and I will say I feel so much more empowered to alter patterns to fit me than I used to before. I'm really pleased with the results. Baby, you're really... What if I held you like a baby? Would that be acceptable? No, like this. No, maybe. Oh, I love you too. Spooky's being so ridiculous. I feel so much more empowered to alter patterns. Then I feel like I kind of understand more of a base, and that I think I thought there was like super proper ways to alter patterns before I took those classes, and now I've learned there's so many different systems. And for me, adding just a little bit to the side works for me. It's like not technically correct. Technically, you're supposed to be adding it to like the middle over here, but it works for me, and so I'm going to continue to do it that way. Oh, you were so sweet. And it resulted in definitely like, this is a better fitting dress than I've made in a while. Like it fits me exactly the way I want. Or not exactly, I guess to a negative. It cuts a little high on the bust. It cuts about here on me. So it needs about another inch of fabric added to the bust, and then that inch detracted from the bias bodice. So I'm writing those notes down for next time I make it. It's another good thing about making stuff like this with fabric that I don't care about as much in theory, which I cared about it more until I saw the discoloration, and then I was like, oh, this is basically a wearable mock-up. So I'll write those notes down. You maybe will have noticed in the reveal that yeah, it's a little funky there, but not anything too noticeable, especially when you compare it to the fit issues with modern clothing. And I think the craftsmanship is nice. I think it's a beautiful dress, and it does make me feel really pretty. And this is a type of green that I haven't always felt I could wear before. I've kind of stopped wearing color rules or whatever. Are you being goosey? Oh, why are you snarling? Sorry, she's just being so cute right now. It's because I haven't fed her yet. I'm very excited, and I'm really excited for the second dress I'm gonna make from this poll. Stay tuned for that in 2 weeks. As always, you can support me over on my Ko-fi. As you can tell, I put a lot of labor and love into this channel, and as well as, I guess, just straight up finances. This was a cheaper dress, but cheaper by a long shot. And so I always appreciate donations or buying me a coffee over on there. And then of course there's the free ways you can support my channel by clicking that subscribe button or liking it, and commenting down below. Me and Spooky here. We'll see you next time. Bye!